Hello everyone, it's me again, and with better lighting this time. I found out after living here for more than 6 months that the light in my kitchen actually works. I never knew that before because it takes literally almost a full minute to turn on. It's one of those fluorescent lights, which I guess takes a while to warm up, and so I just thought that the bulb was burned out and never actually took the time to replace it. But it actually operates. You just have to wait a while for it to turn on, and so I don't have that sort of, well, I guess it's still a little bit divided, but at least that my face is a little more evenly lit this time. It's still daytime outside, and admittedly keeping a light turned on during the daytime is a little bit energy wasteful, but it is just a single fluorescent bulb, so I think it's fairly energy efficient, and I think it won't. I won't feel too bad about the energy used up just keeping one fluorescent light running for the time that it'll take to film this video. So anyhow, this is probably the last video of this kind, actually of any kind, that I'm probably going to upload for quite a while. As I think I mentioned previously, I'm pretty much done with travel type videos, and I think I've made enough of these vlogs. I don't think that many people actually watch them, and that's not to discount the people who do. I'm glad for the people who do and who do comment on these types of videos, but I think that for the most part, me sitting in front of a camera for an hour and just talking about what's on my mind is not really very productive or very interesting for most people. But I'll go ahead and try to tie things up and kind of wrap up with one final subject, which probably I'm planning to make the title of this video, The Meaning of Life. So yeah, the meaning of life, what could be more important than that? What could be more all-encompassing and sort of final than that, right? Obviously I want to emphasize this is just my own thoughts on the matter. As always, I'm just expressing my opinions here. This certainly isn't scientific fact or any other kind of fact. I'm not any sort of God to tell anybody what the meaning of life is or what you should be doing with your life. And indeed, I think that my first answer, I have been asked a couple of times, what do you think the meaning of life is? And my answer, at least now in my stage of greater maturity and awareness, would be the answer is different for everyone. Every person has their own individual meaning of life, and there isn't there isn't one single thing that we all should be doing. I think it's a little bit ridiculous to imagine that every single person in the world should be doing the same thing or serving exactly the same purpose. We all are individuals. We all have our own things that we like doing and that we want to do and that we should be doing, if I may use such a word, if I may imagine that there is such a thing as something that people should or shouldn't do. So it's different for everyone, and I think that you personally need to find the answer for yourself. The answer for you will be different than for anyone else, and I say that for everybody, for every person in the world. Basically every person has their own sort of individual thing or things that lends meaning to their life. I'll give you my own personal answer just as an example. And one thing that I want to mention is a lot of people don't waste their time, well, I shouldn't say it's not necessarily a waste of time, but a lot of people consider it a waste of time, and they say, I'm not going to waste my time thinking about the meaning of life, because I think there's a popular saying that says something like, life is what happens when you're planning it or thinking about it or whatever. So basically, as you're in the act of thinking about life and worrying about life and thinking, what should I be doing with my life? You're actually wasting your time, you're actually wasting your life away dwelling on such thoughts when you could be outside living your life and, doing whatever you want. So, I don't necessarily agree with that, at least me personally. That's certainly not my perspective on things. But if you feel that way, if that's what you believe, then you don't need to ask yourself what's the meaning of life, because you probably already know. There are a lot of people who live life instinctively or intuitively, I may say, and they never really seem to worry too much about what they want to do. They like to do whatever comes to their mind, whatever comes to whatever they happen to feel like doing at that moment, they're happy to do that. and they don't feel the need to worry about what is the meaning of my life, what's the purpose, or what reason do I have for living. If you're that kind of person, if you live that way, if you feel and think that way, then you don't need to ask yourself. You just live intuitively. You live according to your own whims. I don't necessarily want to say whims, because that sounds like I'm sort of trivializing it, and I don't necessarily want to make it seem like that way of living is bad or wrong or anything like that. But it certainly isn't how I live. I am the sort of person to kind of be a little bit more thoughtful, a little more cogitating about it, and kind of think about it. I mean, what am I doing with my life, and why? What gives meaning to my life? Is there indeed something that is important to me? And if you're that kind of person, then you're like me. So I'm kind of speaking to people who are a little bit like me in this video, in that sense, because I think there are lots of people who don't need to ask themselves the meaning of life. But if you've ever asked yourself that, and if that's a question which kind of troubles you, or at least is something that you give a reasonable amount of thought to sometimes, then you're kind of like me in that regard. So what I eventually came to understand for myself, and this for me was a very difficult conclusion to reach, because I think it's not a common conclusion, and I sort of had to figure it out for myself. What gives me meaning in my life, there's not just one thing. I mean, there are several things that are important to me, but if I could place one thing above all else for me personally, what really lends my life meaning and really makes me feel like my life is important is understanding. I think I've mentioned understanding before, and how important understanding is for people. Honestly, when I understand something, and I'm talking about real understanding, I don't just mean like I could tell you that today I went shopping and bought a loaf of bread, or a carton of milk. Okay, you'd understand what I mean, right? I don't just mean that kind of understanding. I mean, when you, I'm sure almost all of us have had this experience where, you're puzzling over a difficult problem. Maybe it's a math problem or something, a logic puzzle or something like that. And you finally just figure it out. There's this thing that's been perplexing you for so long, and bang, all of a sudden, just, the light bulb turns on, and you get it, and you're like, now I understand it. Now everything is clear to me, where before I didn't get it. Now I get it. I've got it right here. That for me is, for me, there's nothing comparable to that. To me, that act of real understanding, of really getting it, of actually deeply comprehending something is, it's more pleasurable to me than enjoying a nice meal. It's more pleasurable to me than listening to some nice music. It's more pleasurable to me than sex, or travel, or going out with friends or whatever. That to me, it's kind of like an orgasm. In sex, there's the orgasm, which is like the climax, that moment where everything comes together. For me, when I learn or study something, when I finally get it, that moment, it's kind of like an orgasm, except I think, for me, at least for me personally, it's more meaningful and feels more relevant to my own life. So yeah, just that act of really understanding something, or someone, or anything like that, any concept like that, that's what makes me feel alive. When that happens to me, I feel like I am vibrant in my act of being alive, and that makes me feel good, and makes me feel like my life has value. So just that understanding, even if it doesn't serve some purpose, sometimes understanding is practical, like you figure out how to, like when you're learning to drive a car, that's a practical skill, or some other practical skill, that's useful. But even if it's not something useful, even if it's just something that that I finally get, that I finally understand, that makes me feel like my life is worth living. That's just, understanding is for me an end in itself. It's not a means to an end. I don't see necessarily education or ideas as serving some greater cause. Just for me, ideas really excite me. And just that act of understanding makes me feel like my life is worth living. There's nothing else that I need other than that in my own life. I think that there are probably other people who are that way, but they're probably not very common. And so for me, it was very difficult to kind of reach that kind of a conclusion because, I grew up believing that understanding serves a greater purpose. You receive an education so that you learn how to, how to get a job. You study how to program a computer or, do some kind of scientific or engineering task or how to write. I mean, writing is a skill that takes some time to develop or something like that. But it was only relatively recently in my life, just a few years ago, that I started to understand that, at least for me, understanding is its own end. It doesn't need to serve something else. That alone for me gives me meaning in my life. So if you're kind of like me in that you think about the meaning of life a lot, you're probably a sort of, dare I say it, a philosophical kind of person who, likes to think about these big questions of life. And if you are that type of person, then you're probably kind of the same way in that, philosophy, I mean, as most of us probably know, what is the meaning of philosophy? It's philosophos, the love of wisdom. Philosophy literally means the love of wisdom. And, wisdom for a philosopher is its own end. You don't need to ask, what do you do with it? What do you do with wisdom? It's not like saying, what do you do with a wrench or a hammer or a screwdriver? You have wisdom and that's it. That's all you need. So that's my own personal answer. That's what lends me meaning in my life more than anything else. And of course, that's not the only thing. I mean, it's not the only thing that's important to me. I value all the other, the usual things. I value love and happiness, and I like to listen to good music. I like to do all these, I like to do normal things. I mean, I think in some ways I'm a relatively normal person, but I'm pretty unusual in the sense that that's what gives me meaning in my life. And to a larger extent, and I know I may be kind of projecting, it may be a little bit tyrannical. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but it may be a little bit presumptuous for me to sort of press my ideas onto other people. But I think that if I may speak for humanity as a group, if there is something that we collectively should be working toward as human beings, I think more than anything else it is understanding. Understanding of ourselves, of our world, and of each other. Because almost anything else is pretty temporary. I mean, a lot of people think that, a lot of people emphasize these sort of modern, not necessarily modern, but especially today, there's sort of this emphasis on progress, and people think that the conquest of space, the development of, bigger and more impressive buildings and cities and bridges and all these structures, improvement of transportation technology and so on and so forth, information technology, computers and the internet. People sort of think that this is progress, that this is advancing humanity to the next sort of evolutionary stage. I'm a little skeptical of such ideas just because I'm not completely convinced that all these things have made our lives better. And of course I use the internet, of course I use computers and the internet extensively. I'm filming a video right now, which when I'm done, I intend to put this video on YouTube. So obviously I use the internet, but I think it's fair to say that, there were ways to do, there were ways to do this before the internet. I mean, if I was doing this 50 years ago, before the internet had really, I guess the internet existed, but it was like a government and academic research project. It wasn't really in people's houses. So if I was doing this like 50 years ago, I would probably be doing this at, there are things like Toastmasters or places like that, speaking clubs and groups and organizations and things like that where people can come together and exchange ideas. And those things have largely disappeared, in large part because of the internet, because the internet has sort of subsumed those roles, but there were certainly ways for people to communicate and come together and share ideas, even on an international scale before the internet. And it couldn't happen internationally, of course. It couldn't happen as quickly or as readily as it can now with the internet, but still there were certainly ways for people to communicate before, even hundreds of years ago. Messages could be sent around the world, or at least certainly to far distant countries, and it might take a few days or even a few weeks for a message to get delivered, but communication was certainly possible. So I'm a little skeptical of the whole idea of progress. I'm not necessarily convinced that that our life is that much better now than it was 100 years ago. And even if it is, that's a whole other discussion which I don't necessarily want to get into. Even if it is, one thing I want to emphasize is that these things don't lend us meaning. These things don't constitute the meaning of our lives or the meaning of our existence, simply because I still have this sort of old-fashioned belief that machines were made to serve us and not the other way around. I worked as a computer system administrator for several years, and I saw a lot of people who were basically on call around the clock, and at any time of the day or night they might be called out to replace a server that had died or something like that. They were basically, their lives were devoted to the service of the machines. And we're sort of entering that kind of society today where we are basically consistently and persistently caught up in the act of trying to maintain the infrastructure that we've built. And it's kind of, it's kind of like the Matrix. The Matrix is an obvious cultural reference. We are sort of, we have been subsumed by or appropriated by the machines, and we are serving them instead of using the machines to make our own lives better and improve our own quality of life, which I don't think is, intuitively to me it seems counterintuitive. It seems like it's kind of the opposite of what we should be doing. So again, I welcome technology. I certainly welcome technology as a way to improve our quality of life, but I don't see it as the meaning of our life, and I think that we've kind of made a mistake in allowing it to adopt that role. And the same is true of politics. Politics are important. I don't want to dismiss the role of politics, but I see a lot of people who devote themselves to political causes and kind of make that the meaning of their lives, which it's just my personal opinion, but I think that's a little bit going off base, because politics, again, is a system that has been constructed for us, for people, to improve our quality of life, to make our lives better, and it shouldn't work the other way around. It shouldn't be that we devote our lives to the maintenance of a political system to make it run well, because then what's the point? It's like you've made a tool to serve a purpose, and yet that purpose is sort of obviated by the need to continue servicing that tool or that system or that structure that you've built to serve some purpose. You've built something to make your life better, but in order to keep it running, you have to devote your life to maintenance of that thing. And that's true whether it's a machine like a computer or a system like a political party or government or anything like that. I think that we've sort of allowed our systems to take over our own lives and become the meaning of our lives, when in fact they were originally just meant to augment our lives. So that's how I feel. But having said that, of course, everyone has their own answer. Existentialism was one of the big watchwords of the mid-20th century. And existentialism is basically this idea that, when people were talking about the meaning of life, existentialism said, yes, there's meaning in life, but you personally, you have to create your own meaning of life. Each person decides it individually, and there isn't some kind of grand unifying cause, which I think I agree with to some extent. Like I said, yes, everyone has their own answer, but again, if there is a cause that we as people, as a group, as a race, as the human race could be working toward, I think I think that understanding is really a good way to go, because understanding, as far as I can tell, as far as I've been able to see, coming to understand ourselves and each other has no, it has no real downsides. You know, it's not like, I guess that's not necessarily true. I mean, there may be things that we don't want to know. There may be some things that we come to understand which make us uncomfortable, or things like that. I know there are probably some people who, I think I've known some people who were undergoing, you know, some sort of therapy, like psychiatric therapy, and who in the act actually discovered things about themselves that they maybe wouldn't have wanted to know. So, and that kind of made them uncomfortable, that they actually discovered something that they had sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Suppressed. They had sort of suppressed something in their minds, and maybe subconsciously they were sort of vaguely aware of it, but they didn't really think about it. And then, you know, undergoing therapy sort of brought that to the forefront of their minds, and they said, oh no, I've really discovered something terrible about myself, which I would rather have not known, and now I'm kind of uncomfortable with that. So I guess it's possible for understanding to have a dark side as well, because we may come to understand things that we don't want to know. But I believe that in the end, ultimately, understanding is for the best. And some people say the opposite. Some people say that, you know what, ignorance is bliss, and your life is better lived just enjoying it. Go out with your friends, go and see a movie, or go to a party or whatever, or just have fun, or even just go for a walk in the park, do whatever, but, you know, don't think about it too much, because if you think about it, you'll just upset yourself and make yourself more depressed and melancholy. Don't even waste time on that, just do that. So if you feel that way, then, and if living that way works for you, then perhaps you should do that. It doesn't work for me. I mean, I've tried living that way, and long term, I just feel like I'm not satisfied with that. Like I'm not happy adopting the idea that ignorance is bliss, because I don't feel happy when I just sort of try to ignore my ideas. So that's me, and obviously not everyone is the same way, and that's fine. People are different. Let me I'm still using the whole bullet points thing, so I'm not reading off a script, but I have made a list of things that I want to touch on. I think that actually works pretty well, because it helps me to stay on track so I don't wander too much, and so that I hit all the points that I wanted to make. But it doesn't sound like I'm reading off a script, which I'm not, because, again, I think that gets pretty boring very quickly. So, one thing I want to add about understanding is that it doesn't have much to do with education in the sense of, you know, formal education, like going to school. Obviously, education is valuable, but it's important for us also to take an active role in our own education. One thing that some of you may know about me, I think I mentioned this way back when I did my first 5 facts video on YouTube, something like, that was, I think, about 4 years ago. I mentioned that I've never gone to school until college. I went to college, but I didn't all through, you know, from kindergarten to high school. I never spent a day as a student in any school. So yeah, I was homeschooled, and I think that worked out pretty well for me. Obviously, homeschooling is kind of, it can be good or bad depending on how it's done. If the parents handle it well and educate their children well, it can be good. It can be better than a public school if they educate the kids well, but often there are times when they don't, so it's kind of, you know, it really depends on the parents and how they do it, how the homeschooling is done. It can be kind of a wild card, but I think in my case it went fairly well. And I grew up having to educate myself, because I wasn't in a classroom. There wasn't a teacher sitting us down in front of books and every day forcing us to read. I had to take an active role in my own education. And, I'm not saying that homeschooling is that everyone has to be homeschooled. Obviously, most of you went to public school, and that's fine. I'm not saying there's something wrong with that, but I want to encourage people to live that way into adulthood, and I want to encourage people to take an active role in your own personal education, because once you get out of school, people aren't going to educate you anymore. Nobody's going to tell you important ideas or things for you to study. You're going to have to do it yourself, and I would like it if people did that more. I think still a lot of people sort of adopt the idea that once they get out of school, they're done. I still hear people say, "I'm out of school now. I graduated from college or whatever. I never have to study anything again. I'm done. I'm done with learning." And I kind of say, I don't really see it that way. I see it the opposite way. Graduating from college, that's not the end of your process of learning. That's just the beginning. Now you've gotten out of school. Now you're in the so-called real world, or whatever you want to call it. Now you personally have to take the responsibility for your education. So this active understanding that I'm talking about, it's not really related to. It's sort of the opposite of what we think of as education. It's not going to a class and having somebody teach you. It's basically you learning for yourself. So that's me. That's what kind of lends meaning to my life and makes me feel like my life is meaningful. One other thing that I want to touch on, again, kind of expanding the idea out and getting a little bit more controversial, because I do tend to be very controversial in these videos that I've made, I've noticed. There is a prevailing idea which I very frequently hear repeated, and I think most people of almost all ages seem to agree with this idea. The idea that in your life, you can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't impact someone else's life or infringe on someone else's rights. So basically it's sort of carte blanche, so to speak. You have basically a free license to do whatever you feel like with your life. You can do whatever you want with your life as long as it doesn't reduce or impact someone else's ability to do the same. That's an ideology that that me personally, I very strongly disagree with. And I'll tell you why. Because it makes a very impersonal and very detached sort of society. It's this mentality that creates homeless people. Just for an example, when you see homeless people on the street, there's this sort of thinking that, that doesn't impact me. I mean, this person, I don't even know this person. They're not my family. They're not my friend. I'm not gonna, what do they have to do with me? They can do what they want. Just get out of my life. And I understand that, we can't all take responsibility for homeless people. I'm not necessarily saying that if you see a homeless person, you should invite them into your home, and give them dinner and give them your guest bedroom and stuff like that. I mean, that I'm not saying that we should adopt them as like our own adopted children or something like that. But it's just this mentality, this mentality that we have creates that sort of way of thinking, that way of living where any other person is just a stranger. They're not even a human being. They're just like an extra in a movie. They're just somebody who you see walking around, and you'll never talk to them or hear from them. You'll catch a brief glance of them, and then they're no longer important to you. That's, I think, what that sort of mentality creates. This sort of idea that other people's lives don't affect me, and I don't like that idea, because almost everything that we do somehow impacts another person. Not directly. I mean, maybe the things that we do don't directly impact another person, but the work that you do, the things that you buy, the way that you live, the way that you handle yourself in society, all of these things do impact other people. We're all linked. We're all related to each other. I don't mean like a family. We're not all necessarily biologically related, although perhaps we are. But I mean, we're all connected in the sense that the things that you and I do have an impact on other people and their lives. And the things that you choose to do or don't do will have repercussions for other people in your society. So I really strongly dislike this sort of modern idea that your life is your own. You just do whatever you want and just don't bother other people, and you'll get along just fine. I don't agree with that at all. That said, I want to draw a contrast between that and the idea of communism, which communism sort of recognized this weakness in modern capitalist society, of course, and sort of tried to do the opposite. And in the Soviet Union, of course, there was famously the elimination of private property. And so there was no such thing as ownership per se of goods or land or things like that. Essentially, all things were owned by the state or by the collective sort of society. And I'm simplifying it somewhat. Actually, in practice, it wasn't that simple. This is sort of the common popular idea of communism in the West. In practice, it wasn't quite that simple. I mean, there was still such a thing as private property, and things could be owned in the Soviet Union. But for simplicity's sake, just for this discussion, let me just sort of imagine that it was that simple. That's kind of it's good and bad. I mean, if you talk to people today in Russia about the Soviet times, they'll say, there were some things that were so much better in the Soviet times, and there are other things which were so much worse. So, that's a striking contrast with the sort of lifestyle that we see in modern sort of so-called capitalism. But I just want to ask. Don't these two sort of seem like extremes? I mean, on the one hand, we have people who say that my life is totally my own business and nobody else should interfere with it. Nobody else has anything to do with my life. I can do whatever I want and it doesn't impact anyone and nobody affects me. And on the other hand, you have essentially the elimination of private property altogether. Aren't these kind of extremes? I mean, come on, people. Isn't there sort of a middle ground? Isn't there sort of a compromise or a balance between total social isolation and elimination of privacy and private life altogether? Isn't there some kind of compromise we can reach? Some people would say that we have found a compromise and that there is a compromise in modern socialism. And socialism is essentially, it is basically a balance. There is such a thing as welfare. There is such a thing as, public assistance given to people who need it, people who are unemployed or, who are sick or whatever, or have special problems. But you can still have private property. You can still run a business and, make your own money and so on. So some people would say that that's a good compromise, and politically, I guess it is. I mean, in terms of the political system, the systems that we have today in the West are pretty decent. And even the United States is a sort of a socialist country. People don't think of it that way. People say that the United States is very capitalist and very selfish. Compared to most of Europe, it probably is, yes. But in a true capitalist society, there would be no such thing as taxes. And there would be absolutely no such thing as public assistance or welfare or anything like that. And these things do exist in the United States. So the United States is at least a somewhat socialist state. It's not so much as, like I said, as most European countries, for example. But this sort of balance, this sort of liberal socialist capitalism is the prevailing system in actually in most countries today, not only the Western countries, but also places like China are sort of adopting a similar model. Politically, that's fine, but socially, it still leaves the same problem. Again, I said before that politics is something that's created to help us, but it's not the meaning of our lives. And so politically, we've sort of come out to a decent compromise. I'm not saying that, I mean, communism has some appeal to me, but obviously the Soviet Union wasn't ideal. It wasn't any kind of perfect model of an ideal government. So the compromises that we're sort of seeing now are, I think, decent for the most part. But socially, the way that people live socially is more important to me than how they live politically. And socially, we still see these same attitudes with people saying, if you talk to a stranger, they would just say, "Look, man, I don't know you. I mean, why are you even talking to me? What do you expect me to do with you? Just leave me alone and go live your own life. Don't come into my life because I don't know you." And I don't like that attitude. I don't like that mindset or that way of living. Socially, that's something that I would like to see change. And I think we're actually going completely the opposite way. Instead of creating a society where strangers are a little bit more friendly with each other and a little more warm with each other, I think we're going in exactly the opposite direction, where people are becoming more impersonal, more isolated, and society is basically becoming more fragmented and more broken, with each person sort of being an island unto themselves. I mentioned a while ago I wrote a short novel called Islands in the Fog. And the islands in the fog are the people, because each person is essentially today increasingly living like an island unto themselves. And there's just this fog separating them, so they barely even see each other. They just sort of live in total isolation. That is the social sort of image that I see us moving toward, and I don't like that at all. So people talk a lot about politics, and politics are all well and good. Sure, I mean, politics are important, but that to me, politics are not as important as the actual people and how people live and how they approach their communities and the people who live, around them. So, yeah. So this idea of just doing what you want and keeping out of other people's business. Most people who advocate that way of thinking seem to think that it improves quality of life, that it basically makes for a better quality of life because you can do what you want without somebody else telling you what you have to do. I kind of see it the opposite way, though. I actually see it as giving us a lower quality of life, because what really makes our lives meaningful ultimately is other people. And I talked before about understanding being important to me, and it is, but I don't just want to keep that understanding to myself. I mean, I want to share it with other people. I want to talk about my ideas with other people. I want to get to know other people. I want to understand people. I don't just want to understand, math problems or something abstract like that. I mean, math is interesting to me. I do like math and science and all those things. That is also interesting to me. But I do also want to understand people and psychology and that kind of thing. So I don't feel like my life would be very meaningful if it didn't have people in it. And, you hear about people sometimes who for whatever reason are rich. Somehow they fell into a lot of money, but they don't have any friends, and their money couldn't buy them happiness. And so even though they're rich and they might live in a nice house and have all this luxury, they still feel miserable because they're all alone. And so I believe that actually dropping this sort of ideology of impersonal living and sort of doing away with this idea that my life doesn't relate to other people's lives, if we did away with that thinking, I think that we would actually improve our quality of lives significantly, because we would be bringing more people into our lives, and vice versa. Other people would be bringing us into their lives. And that would mean less privacy, that would mean less independence and all that. But so what? I mean, is it really? I don't really understand this whole emphasis on privacy that sort of exists in people's minds today. I mean, privacy. Okay, I understand. If you're you don't want people to necessarily know what your credit card number is. That's kind of secret information. Okay, I wouldn't just hand out my credit card number to people. Privacy, if you're sitting on the toilet, okay, maybe you'd like to have some privacy and not have people watching you. Okay, that I can understand. But privacy in the sense of like always being alone and not having other people around you, which again is becoming kind of our social model today. I just don't get that. Why would you want to live in total isolation? Why would you want to be so absolutely alone that nobody else can see you or speak to you or anything like that? Why would people want to live that way? It doesn't really make sense to me. So I think that we could improve our quality of life if people were a little more together and a little more integrated and a little more a little more human to each other, whatever that means. And I don't just mean living in proximity to each other. It's kind of funny because the more people you have in one place, the more impersonal and the more divided and detached they tend to be. There's that scene at the end of, or towards the end of Crocodile Dundee, where the guy who used to live in the jungle or whatever goes to New York City, and he's told that New York City had what was it, something like 10 million people living in it, and his reaction was, "Wow, imagine a city with millions of people living in it together. This must be the friendliest place in the world." And of course the joke is that it's exactly the opposite, that New York City is actually a very cold and very distant place, because people have to be that way, because to have that many people living in proximity to each other, they basically have to just ignore each other. So it actually goes, it's actually that way that the more people you have, the less friendly and the less social they are, because they sort of have to be that way just to function and to live with each other. If you have just a few people together, then it's more relaxed, then people can do whatever and be more close to each other. So yeah, it sounds kind of old-fashioned. I understand that this idea of living in a small town and having, going to places where everybody knows who you are, all these things sound very old-fashioned and very, some people might say these ideas are obsolete, but I don't believe that they are. I don't believe that these ideas can ever go obsolete, because these are fundamental to human life and to the human experience. And by embracing this sort of modern mentality of impersonal society and highly regulated sort of society, we're actually doing away with the human element and making ourselves less human. What I do find interesting also is that in a lot of the countries where things have been most, where the problems of poverty and hunger and sickness and suffering and all that have been done away with, this is where you'll find people who are the most impersonal and the most sort of cold and kind of self-centered, as opposed to, if you go to a poor country, if you go to an impoverished sort of village in Africa or places like that, that's where people tend to be more welcoming. That's where people tend to act more like human beings and sort of believe that we're all we're all brothers and sisters and we're all equal, and people don't think too much about the divisions between them. I guess that's not always true. I mean, there are civil wars and ethnic clashes and things like that which take place in those places, but there's more of a tendency for people to connect with each other and unite with each other, as opposed to the sort of modern mindset where people have a tendency to be more divided and more detached from each other. And it was for that reason that for much of my life I embraced sort of, I hate to use this term because it's such a meaningless term, but for most of my life I sort of embraced right-wing kind of politics. And I say that not, right-wing politics means so many different things. I just embraced the social and economic model of right-wing government because it was and is sort of a mentality that embraces people looking after each other. In the first round of, I think it was in the first round of presidential debates, we're just going into, a major U.S. election. I think it was in the first round of debates that Romney said something about people taking care of each other. He said that his ideal was, rather than government handouts being given to people, that communities would actually come together and support their needy. And that was something that I've always believed in. That was something that I've always sort of embraced and said, yeah, that's how it should be done. Because if you look at these, again, these very socialist countries, like the ones in Europe, the concept of generosity and, helping people out is kind of non-existent in those places. I mean, you may do people just a simple favor, like lending them something or something like that, but essentially those are places where generosity and support, that's something that's mandated. Those things are mandated by law, and so of course a lot of tax money is taken from the wealthy people and given to people who need it, which is not a bad thing, but it eliminates the concept of giving. It eliminates the concept of voluntary, willful giving of generosity to people, because most people are so taken care of anyhow that everybody sort of has their needs met. And people with means have it forcibly taken from them in the form of taxes, and people without means have it given to them by a government, by a bureaucracy, which is trying to look after its people, and that's not bad. But again, there isn't really any need for generosity, and so people who live in those places kind of tend to feel like their lives are meaningless because there isn't really anything that people need. It's almost like some people will say, I'm sure some people will say that this sounds absolutely ridiculous, but I think that in a certain way there are some societies, like my ancestral country of Finland, which are almost too peaceful. And I acknowledge that some people will say that's ridiculous. How can you have a place that's too peaceful? How can you have too much peace? That's almost a stupid idea. But you have these countries like the Nordic countries in Europe, and also I've never been to Japan, but I've been told that Japan is kind of the same way, that life is almost too orderly. It's too nice and laid out, and everybody has whatever they need taken care of, and there's no need for decision making or kind of stuff like that. You just, every decision is already made for you. You just kind of enjoy your life and live your life, and you don't have to think about things too much. That idea has been discussed for a long time. I mean, this idea predates the 20th century, this idea of the modern socialist utopia. And the question that comes up, of course, is that a utopia or a dystopia? Is that a vision of a perfect future, Or is that just another kind of nightmare where people have all their needs met by some faceless system, and there's no need for people to reach out and touch each other? There's no need for human contact because you have all your needs met. Isn't that just another sort of nightmare that people would want to escape from? And I think it is. I think that's kind of the society that we've built for ourselves. We've sort of built a world where people don't need each other anymore, which is good and bad. I mean, it's not a. I mean, it's not a terrible thing in a sense. I mean, I guess it's better than having people dying from civil war or hunger or, being bombed to death, having children shot in the streets or something like that. Okay, yeah, that's maybe this is an improvement over that, but what have we become? What have we become as people when we don't serve each other, when we don't attend to each other or pay any attention to each other, but simply have our needs met by some perfect system that has been architected. So, I'm not. I'm not saying that I endorse Romney. I don't really endorse any political candidate. Again, politics for me are not that important. For me, what's more important than politics is how people actually live on a day-to-day basis. More important than the system that we've built for those people is how people actually are and how they actually live their lives. So I'm not all that politically motivated or oriented, but without not trying to throw my support behind anyone. But what Romney said sort of resonated with me because that's what I've always believed. And of course, so-called Republican people often embrace that idea, not because they actually want people to take care of each other, but because it means more money for them, because lower taxes and less public support means more money for the rich people. So, there may be an ulterior motive there. There's, sort of an unspoken selfishness there, and they say, hey, just, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, it'll work out fine. And so, yeah, I understand that. I understand that these wealthy people who embrace right-wing government are not necessarily thinking of the poor people. They're just trying to save their own money. So I'm not endorsing republicanism or anything like that, but a sort of idealized model of community and of people taking care of each other, the sort of small town mentality, as opposed to a big welfare state, is sort of what when I was young, that was what I had envisioned as a world that I wanted to live in. So that's all I'm really saying, and that's meaningful because it then allows people to help each other. It allows people to intervene in each other's lives and improve each other's lives. And you might say that it's corny, you might say that it doesn't really seem to mean very much, but it actually does, because it makes people feel like their lives are important. And each person can feel better about themselves if they feel like their life has a purpose. You can improve your own personal quality of life if you feel like your life is valuable. And you can do that by, creating something valuable with your life. But if people have all their needs met, if people don't need help, if people are sort of in the situation where they don't need anything and they just live by themselves independently and in isolation, then the opposite happens. Then life actually doesn't feel very meaningful, because even though you are alive and you may not be suffering in some obvious way, then you come back to the question, what is the meaning of life? Why am I alive? What's the purpose of my life? So we've sort of, in solving all our problems, we've sort of created another problem. I think that, again, this idea of progress was a little bit counterproductive, but because in producing this this perfect sort of system and this ideal future for everyone, we've sort of caused people to step back and ask why. Why are we even alive at all? So that's what I would say. That's what I would encourage for everyone. Try to come together, not in a in the way that it's usually done. I mean, I don't really see a lot of social togetherness created by things like parties. You know, people go to parties and they dance together and they drink and listen to music together. But I don't think that really creates togetherness so much because people aren't really connecting with each other. They're not really talking to each other. For the most part, they're just dancing and having fun. And, you know, when they go home, how much will they really have learned about each other? How much will they really have shared with each other? I don't know. For me at least, I don't see that as being very meaningful to me, although I understand that for some people, you know, dancing and doing this whole party thing is very important to them and very meaningful to them personally. So, again, it's just my opinion, my perspective. This is how I feel about it. But I think that like a real meaningful, like a deeper connection between people, not just sharing a party, but like sharing your thoughts and your feelings and your experiences and your hopes and your dreams with people. I think that would bring people together a lot more than just a fun party. But what do I know? I don't have any friends anyway, so it's not like I'm one to talk, am I? The last thing I just want to mention is I think a lot of people are discouraged because they don't have a lot of dramatic sort of twists and turns in their lives. I think a lot of the time we suffer because of stories and how fictional stories, whether it's in books or movies or whatever, sort of represent lives. And growing up, I think I always sort of had this idea that that my life would be kind of like a fairy tale, in the sense that it would, you know, have a logical beginning and a middle and an end. You know, when you study writing, when you study story writing in school, your teachers tell you every story needs to have a good beginning. The story begins here and there's some premise, and there's a middle where the story is developed, and then there's an end where everything is tied together and things come to a satisfactory conclusion. I was taught that growing up, and I think most of you probably were as well. And the problem with that is that real life doesn't work that way. The problem is that most people's lives aren't a novel in which things begin with, you know, with a premise and everything is resolved in a tidy fashion at the end. Life doesn't work that way. Most people's lives don't have some magnificent climactic event. And it may be the case for some people. I think also part of the problem is that some people do have that. Like if you think about, for example, Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, right? So if you think about Neil Armstrong, that's what you'll think about. You'll think about the moment that he touched down on the moon and made his famous speech that's, you know, it's one step for a man, but a great leap for mankind and all that. But Armstrong lived for how long? I think he's just left us. Sorry, I don't know the details, but I believe Armstrong just passed away like maybe a year or two ago, and I think he was something like 80 years old. So this was a guy who lived a whole life. You know, his life wasn't just that one moment of touching down on the moon or the you know, however much time he spent in training for that. This was a man who had, I'm sure he had certain types of food that he liked to eat. I'm sure he had certain types of music that he liked to listen to. I'm sure that there were hobbies and things like that he had. He probably had friends and family whom he spent a lot of time with. So this guy's life was just that. It was a long life full of normal things that people do. And not everyone has this one fantastic moment that they become famous for. So, you know, there are a lot of people who are highlighted in history for some incredible thing that they did. But again, what we sort of lose sight of is that those people are the exceptions. Those people are highlighted specifically because their lives were so exceptional. And most people don't live that way. Most people's lives don't turn out that way. So don't be disappointed. And this is something that, again, I sort of had to learn for myself because nobody really made this clear for me. I just sort of had to, intuitively figure it out. And it seems obvious when you say it. When I say it now, it might seem obvious, but sort of subconsciously, I think a lot of us imagine that we'll have some incredible fairy tale life, that some magnificent thing will happen to us, and that at the end of our lives there will be some fantastic conclusion with fireworks. But it doesn't really go that way. Most people, myself included, we kind of go through our lives and we'll have experiences. There will be some experiences that are memorable to us and some things which are not memorable. A lot of life will just be kind of routine, everyday stuff that won't be very important to us. And at the end, when you start looking back on your life, it's not necessarily going to be like a story. It's not going to be like a fairy tale or a novel where things proceeded in some logical fashion, in some logical order, and where the plot threads sort of went in a way that a novel story would go. It doesn't work like that. Life isn't like that. You live your life, you'll have some experiences which may be fairly random and might not be very significant to you, and at the end, a lot of the things that you did won't necessarily make for a thrilling story. But that doesn't mean that life is any less valuable. That doesn't mean that your life is any less important or less valuable just because it doesn't read like a movie script. I guess that's all. I guess that's it. I'm recording this shortly before I leave Europe to go back to the United States, and I'll be living back in the States for a while, in a place where life isn't so perfect, where life isn't as cleanly laid out for people, where people still have a little bit more in the way of real problems. And in one sense that's sad, but in another sense that also kind of lends meaning to life. There's a certain sense of purpose that comes from having challenges in your life. So I'll be closing this chapter of my life and starting a new one, and for all those of you out there who are doing the same, I hope that that your lives will go well, and that you also will find meaning and value in your lives. Thank you for watching, everyone. Signing out for now, but I hope that everyone's doing well and will continue to be so. Goodbye, everyone.